People think infrastructure is mainly about engineering, but beneath that is a financial system designed around long-duration cash flow, leverage, incentives, and the movement of capital through time. That realization changes everything. Because once roads, railways, utilities, housing, and public systems become financial assets, they stop being shaped only by public need. They also become shaped by the logic of finance, and over time, that quietly changes what gets built, what gets prioritized, what becomes affordable, and eventually, what societies become dependent on. People make projects that brings profits, but profits decide which projects get built and what people become. This is Bytnar Talks. People, projects, profits. I spend a lot of time between people planning projects and people delivering them, and those two worlds don't always see things the same way. One side sees infrastructure as delivery, the other sees infrastructure as capital allocation. And what's interesting is how often both are talking about the same project while actually operating inside completely different realities. Because from site level, a bridge is concrete, steel, sequencing, labor, interfaces, and risk. From a financing perspective, it's something else entirely. It's duration, yield, predictability, cash flow, risk transfer, debt servicing, long-term financial behavior. When you keep on analyzing major programs, transport systems, utilities, regeneration schemes, or long-duration infrastructure environments, you start noticing something. The physical project is only one layer. Underneath it sits an invisible architecture of financing structures, incentives, obligations, repayment schedules, political timelines, investor expectations, procurement pressures, and risk distribution. And most people never really get shown that layer. They experience the visible result: the road, the tunnel, the housing development, the utility bill, the toll, but not the financial logic sitting underneath it. So today, I want to slow down a bit and unpack that properly. Not from a conspiracy angle, not from a cynical angle, although that'd be quite difficult to achieve. I just want to lay it down for you as it is. Preparing for this podcast and recording, it also helps my thoughts coalesce around this topic a little bit more. Because this isn't really about whether infrastructure financing is good or bad. It's about understanding the system clearly enough to recognize what incentives are shaping outcomes. And once you do that, a lot of things that felt disconnected start making more sense. A few years ago, I heard a child ask a very simple question. Why do we still pay for roads if they've been already built? And it's one of those questions adults usually move past very quickly. Because we're used to the idea of tolls, charges, taxes, service payments, infrastructure fees, it feels normal. It is painful though. No one wants to pay for things we naturally consider paid for in taxes. But the question itself is actually pointing towards something deeper. Because a road is not just a physical object, it's also a financial relationship stretched across time. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Especially when proceeds do not go back to the shared kitty, but is extracted out of the governing system. Historically, infrastructure was often imagined as something society built collectively. Painful upfront costs, but then we could benefit from it for a long time. The ownership. When the bridge gets built, we can cross the river. The railway exists and moves us around for business and leisure. The dam operates so we are safe in our homes and can light them up. not in fire, but as a light switch thing. Eventually, the asset simply becomes part of the background of public life. But modern infrastructure increasingly behaves differently, because now many large projects are financed through structures designed around long-term repayment horizons. The asset may be physically completed in 5 years, but the financial relationship attached to it may last 30, 40, sometimes even longer. And once that happens, the infrastructure stops being only infrastructure. It becomes a financial instrument. Now, importantly, that's not necessarily a criticism, because financing allows projects to open opportunities to happen earlier than they otherwise could. Most governments do not sit on enormous pools of idle cash waiting to build mega projects outright. Although we'd like to pretend that we have pounds so we can print as many as possible, like they do there with dollars. Credit allows future productivity to be pulled into the present. That's one of the defining features of modern economies. And to be fair, without financing structures, many major projects simply would not happen. But beneath that practical reality is another one. The financing itself starts shaping the project. It shapes procurement, it shapes timelines, it shapes ownership models, it shapes risk allocation, it shapes operational pressure, and eventually it shapes public behavior around that asset. Because once stable long-term payments exist, capital begins treating infrastructure the same way it treats other income-generated assets. Non-emotionally, structurally, predictable cash flow attracts finance. Finance flows towards predictability. And over time, infrastructure becomes increasingly integrated into a wider capital system. Which means roads stop being just roads. Utilities stop being just utilities. Housing stops being just housing. And that changes how societies function, even if most people never consciously notice it. A useful way to think about this is through housing, actually. Imagine two identical houses, same design, same material, same location, even the same builders. From the outside, they are effectively the same asset, but the financing structures behind them are completely different. One owner secures low-cost, long-duration borrowing. The other entered a far more expensive financing arrangement. Over 30 years, the total cost difference becomes enormous. Not because the building changed, the financing changed. And infrastructure works the same way. When people hear the headline cost of a major program, they often assume they are hearing the cost of construction. But in reality, the visible construction cost is often only part of the story. Underneath it sits financing. Interest, refinancing, risk pricing, capital expectations, return thresholds, debt servicing, long-duration obligations. And over time, those financial structures can become larger than the original construction cost itself. That's the part most public conversation rarely unpack properly, because engineering feels tangible, finance feels abstract, and the living is now. But the financing layer often determines the long-term behavior of the asset more than the physical structure itself. And you see this repeatedly in large delivery environments. Projects that appear technically achievable begin experiencing pressure from the financial architecture around them. Timelines tighten, risk gets pushed downwards, interfaces become more aggressive, delivery pressure increases, decision-making compresses, and eventually the operational environment starts behaving differently because the financial model requires it. This is where people sometimes misunderstand project pressure. They assume pressure originates from site. Very often, it started much earlier. inside financing assumptions, inside program commitments, inside commercial structures, inside repayment expectations. And by the time the pressure reaches delivery teams, the project is already carrying financial momentum. You can feel it, especially on major programs. Meetings become more cautious, tolerance for delay shrinks, reporting becomes more important, recovery language increases, people start solving today instead of managing tomorrow. Not because individuals are bad at their jobs, because systems behave differently once financial pressure accumulates. And that's where projects stop being purely technical. They become organizational stress tests. Now, this is the point where the conversation gets more interesting. Because people often assume governments always choose the cheapest path. But governments don't operate inside purely mathematical timelines. They operate inside political timelines and reality. Election cycles, public pressure, budget constraints, short-term accountability, and infrastructure lives on completely different timescales. Look, a bridge may last 120 years. In fact, we designed it for that time. A government term may last just 4. And once you recognize that mismatch, a lot of infrastructure behavior starts making more sense. Because from the outside it's easy to ask, why use financing structures that cost more over time? But underneath that question is another one. What happens if the project doesn't happen at all? Imagine a city with deteriorating transport system. Congestion worsening, economic activity slowing, public frustration increasing. The technically cheaper option may require enormous immediate public spending. The politically survivable option may spread costs across future decades. And once pressure becomes immediate enough, future cost becomes easier to defer. Not because people are careless, because incentives distort time horizons. That's a very important distinction. This is not usually a story about villains. It's a story about the systems we live in. Politicians are rewarded for visible delivery, but the sack is empty. Financial institutions are rewarded for structuring investable assets, and there is a great customer that never fails to pay back. Voters reward immediate improvement more than invisible accounting structures, and when those incentives align, long-duration financing becomes extremely attractive, even if the total long-term cost increases. Because the system prioritizes immediate functionality over distant arithmetic. Now again, that doesn't automatically make the decision irrational. Sometimes delaying infrastructure causes greater economic damage than financing it aggressively. Sometimes growth itself depends on accelerated delivery. But the important thing is understanding the trade-off clearly, because every financing structure leaves a footprint on the future. And once enough projects are financed this way, societies gradually accumulate layers of long-duration obligation. There's no dramatic collapse, no hidden scandal behind it, just accumulated commitments. And over time, those commitments begin shaping future choices. That's where the deeper systems questions start appearing. How much future flexibility should be exchanged for present capability? There isn't a clear universal answer, but it's a real question, and infrastructure is one of the clearest places to observe it. One of the answers could be perhaps that if the spend isn't productive, doesn't really pay off, isn't sustainable, of good quality, if it doesn't improve anything, isn't necessary really, then there really isn't a point of doing it. There's another shift underneath all this that's worth understanding. At a certain point, infrastructure stopped being viewed purely as public utility, and increasingly became viewed as an asset class. That language shift matters, Because utilities, toll roads, energy systems, transport networks, housing portfolios, data infrastructure, logistic corridors, once they generate stable, predictable cash flow, they become attractive to institutional capital. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, private equity, infrastructure investment funds, insurance capital. Why? Because infrastructure behaves differently from volatile markets. It's slower, more predictable, long duration, relatively stable, and capital is constantly searching for predictable environments, especially large capital. So once infrastructure enters that financial orbit, projects begin being designed not only for operational performance, but for investment behavior. Cash flow reliability matters. Risk transfer matters. Contract stability matters. Revenue predictability matters. Operational continuity matters. And that begins reshaping how projects are structured. Now, from one perspective, this is extremely useful because attracting capital unlocks development. Without investable structures, many systems would stagnate. But there's another side to it. Once infrastructure becomes financially integrated at scale, public systems begin operating partly according to financial logic, and financial logic prioritizes different things. Predictability, yield, risk management, cash flow certainty, scalability. That doesn't always perfectly align with social outcomes. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And that tension is becoming increasingly visible across modern economies. Housing is probably one of the clearest examples. At one level, housing is shelter. At another level, it's collateral. It's investment. It's leveraged appreciation. It's debt expansion. It's institutional exposure. It's financial security. And once an asset serves both social and financial roles simultaneously, pressure starts building between those functions. You begin seeing it everywhere. Infrastructure, utility, transport, urban development, public services. The visible layer says one thing, the financial layer often says another. And understanding both at the same time is where systems thinking becomes important. Now, historically, there's a reason this accelerated. And I think understanding that context helps people make sense of the modern environment. You see, and as the history lesson here coming your way, be prepared. In 1971, the Bretton Woods system effectively ended. There's a monetary system that started after the war. You see, after war, we have been hooked on the dollar that was hooked on the gold. And all of a sudden, a yellow man put up tariffs. Oh, sorry. No, it wasn't that guy, and it was not tariffs. It was Nixon and his default on promises and his petrodollar play changed everything. Ever since, the rest of the world remained hooked on dollar with no meaningful backing and energy cost paid for. And guess what? Dollar. So currencies moved away from direct gold convertibility, remained hooked on dollar. So the capital markets expanded, financial systems liberalized, credit creation accelerated. And over the following decades, finance became increasingly central to global economic behavior. Now, this is not one of those conversations where we pretend everything before that was perfect. Frankly, it wasn't. But the operating environment changed dramatically. Capital became more mobile, financial innovation expanded, debt market deepened, leverage increased, cross-border investment accelerated, and infrastructure increasingly became integrated into global financial systems, which meant projects were no longer simply local public works. They became investable financial environments. And over time, that changed the speed of everything. Welcome to the new Ponzi scheme. Growth accelerated, urbanization accelerated, asset expansion accelerated, debt expansion accelerated, infrastructure financing accelerated, the scale became extraordinary. And to be fair, that acceleration built enormous capability. And, well, by the way, modern transport systems, energy systems, digital infrastructure, global logistics, mass urban development, but systems organized around expanding credit also create momentum. Because credit pulls future productivity into the present, and eventually societies begin depending on continued expansion to maintain stability. That's where things become more structurally interesting, because once growth expectations become embedded into financing systems, slowing down becomes difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. And infrastructure sits right in the middle of that dynamic. Because infrastructure both enables growth and depends on growth assumptions, which means modern infrastructure is not just engineering, it's deeply connected to monetary architecture. The capital flow, the debt behavior, the investment systems, the economic expectations, and that's usually the part missing from mainstream discussions. Now, one of the most important parts of this entire discussion is understanding where pressure eventually lands. Because large financial systems do not absorb pressure evenly. Pressure flows through structures and eventually it reaches delivery. This is something people in projects recognize immediately. You can feel when timelines tighten. You can feel when commercial pressure increases. You can feel when margins compress. You can feel when reporting starts becoming more defensive. You can feel when organizations become reactive instead of coordinated. And often, when what's happening underneath is financial pressure moving downwards through the system. At the top level, large programs are often structured around financing assumptions that require stability, predictability, controlled risk, protected returns. But the physical world is not perfectly predictable. Reality introduces uncertainty constantly. Ground conditions, supply chains, labor markets, regulation, inflation, political change, design coordination issues, interface management, human behavior, weather, and more. And somewhere inside that environment, someone has to absorb that volatility. Very often, it flows downwards. Into subcontractors, into suppliers, into operational teams, into delivery interfaces, into compressed timelines, into recovery pressure. This is where capability becomes incredibly important. Because organizations under financial pressure behave differently depending on operational maturity. Strong systems maintain decision quality under pressure. Weak systems become reactive. Strong organizations maintain coordination. Weak organizations fragment. Strong leadership preserves clarity. Weak environments drift. That's why projects are effectively life stress tests. Not just technically, organizationally, culturally, financially, behaviorally. And often the visible issue people react to is not the original issue at all. It's the downstream symptom of accumulated pressure moving through the system. This is also why effort alone rarely solves structural problems. People work incredibly hard in delivery environments. Usually that's not the issue. The issue is whether systems can sustain complexity under pressure. That's capability. And capability becomes visible very quickly once financial pressure starts accelerating timelines and compressing decisions. One of the quieter truths about credit-based systems is that obligations accumulate gradually, rarely dramatically, like a compound interest, but of sort you and I have to pay, not gain from. It accumulates slowly, and because the system keeps functioning, people adopt to it. A society can carry long-duration obligation for decades. The issue isn't usually immediate collapse. The issue is narrowing flexibility over time. And you can observe this both personally and institutionally these days. A family refinances a house, for example, then refinances again, then expands, then consolidates. Every decision made sense individually. The house improves, life improves, but eventually, future income becomes increasingly pre-allocated. Infrastructure behaves similarly. Every project is justified individually. This railway improves growth, this tunnel improves trade, this regeneration improves productivity, this financing structure unlocks delivery, and often those things are true. But over decades, accumulated obligations begin shaping what future governments, organizations, and societies are able to do next. Budgets become less flexible. Maintenance obligations increase. Debt servicing expands. Operational dependence deepens. Existing commitments compete with future priorities. And eventually the question becomes less about what we want to build and more about what we are already committed to sustaining. Now, importantly, this does not mean infrastructure investment is bad. Quite the opposite. Modern societies depend on it. The issue is understanding the relationship between progress and obligation clearly. Because credit-based growth systems create both simultaneously. And once you understand that, you stop viewing infrastructure as isolated projects. You begin viewing it as accumulated economic architecture, which changes how you understand public finance, urban development, housing, utilities, transport systems, even organizational behavior. Because systems eventually adapt around their obligations. And that shapes culture more than people realize. So underneath all of this, what's the bigger point? I think the deeper reality is infrastructure reveals the operating logic of the societies building it. What gets funded reveals what systems reward. What gets prioritized reveals how incentives are structured. What gets delayed reveals where capability is constrained. And the financing structures underneath projects quietly shape behavior all the way through delivery environments. Because structures shape behavior faster than intentions do. That's something you see repeatedly. If timelines reward speed over coordination, systems behave reactive. If financing rewards predictable cash flow, projects become structured around financial stability. If organizations reward reporting over visibility, people become cautious. If commercial pressure flows downward, operational behavior changes. None of this requires malicious intent. Systems create patterns, and projects make those patterns visible. That's why I talk so much about capability rather than just capacity. Because most delivery environments can increase activity. The harder question is whether systems can absorb complexity without losing coherence. Can organizations maintain alignment under pressure? Can they preserve decision quality? Can they coordinate uncertainty? Can they recognize drift early enough? Can they manage interfaces before pressure compounds? That's capability. And infrastructure environments expose capability gaps very quickly, especially once financial pressure accelerates timelines. This is very much the kind of complexity we spend time around at Bytnar. Not simply technical delivery, the systems underneath delivery, because projects are rarely just engineering problems. They are organizational environments shaped by incentives, finance, coordination, pressure, and behavior. And once you recognize that, you stop treating visible problems as isolated events. You start looking underneath them. One starts to break those things apart and reassemble them so they work. I always say to my clients, if you want a commodity, just send an invite to tender out or ask for a quotation. If you want to build capacity, invite people inside. Talk to the other side, to your consultant, to your engineer. This is the opportunity to understand each other capacity, and to establish a relationship in which both parties can grow together. But most importantly, so that you as an organization get better results and get better overall at what you do. And getting better is a doing word, not a done and dusted word. Keep that in mind. So if we bring all of this together, what changes once you understand infrastructure this way? I think the first thing is that projects stop looking isolated. You start recognizing them as part of larger financial and organizational systems. The road isn't just asphalt, the railway isn't just transport, the housing development isn't just housing. Underneath each one sits financing logic. Incentives, time horizons, risk structures, political pressure, capital behavior, and those invisible systems shape visible outcomes constantly. The second thing is that pressure starts making more sense. You realize operational stress often begins upstream, inside financing assumptions, inside commercial structures, inside repayment expectations, inside incentive systems. And by the time delivery teams feel the pressure, the momentum already exists. The third thing is that infrastructure begins revealing broader truths about society itself. Because what gets rewarded gets built, and what gets built eventually shapes behavior. That's true organizationally, economically, socially, culturally, and over time, societies begin adapting around the systems they create, which means infrastructure is never just physical, it's behavioral architecture too. And maybe that's the deeper thing worth sitting with. The environments created by incentives eventually reshape the people living inside them. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, structurally, and once you notice that, you start seeing infrastructure very differently. Usually, these things become easier to navigate once the underlying structures become visible early enough. A lot of this comes down to whether organizations have the capability structures to absorb complexity properly before pressure starts distorting behavior. And that's very much the kind of work I spend time around at Bytnar. There's no neat ending to this one, just the reality of how these systems tend to operate. Infrastructure isn't only engineering, it's incentives, finance, coordination, pressure, behavior. And over time, those things become physical. So if this gave you a different lens to look through, then it's done its job. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.